Imagine waking up as a 14-year-old girl in the year 1347, not in your warm bed at home, but on a straw mattress so thin you can feel every stone beneath it pressing into your spine. The bell for matins has just rung. It's 2 hours past midnight in the depths of winter, and you must rise immediately or face punishment. Your name is Marguerite, and 3 months ago, your father delivered you to the gates of Saint Agnes Abbey in northern France. Not because you felt called to serve God, but because he had 7 daughters and could only afford dowries for 2. This is your life now, one of 60 women locked behind these walls, never to leave again until death claims you. The cold seeps through your rough woolen habit, the only garment you'll wear for the rest of your days. Already crawling with lice you're forbidden to scratch during prayers. Your stomach gnaws with hunger that will never fully cease. Your fingers crack and bleed from endless labor, and the woman sleeping next to you coughs wetness that speaks of the lung rot that has already claimed 3 sisters this winter. You don't yet know that the Black Death rides toward these walls, that half your sisters will die choking on their own blood within the year, or that you'll survive, only to spend 50 more years in this stone prison, forgotten by the family who abandoned you here. Before diving into these forgotten seekers of history's shadows, into the lives of women whose names were erased from memory the moment they passed through convent gates, I want to remind you that history holds countless untold stories of suffering and endurance. If you enjoy learning about these hidden truths of our past, about the people who lived and died in silence, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that brings forgotten voices back to life. Please comment below to share where you're listening from tonight, whether you're in a warm bed in America, a flat in London, or somewhere else entirely. It's remarkable that we're connected across continents, exploring these ancient stories together, finding comfort in our modern lives by remembering those who had none. Sweet dreams, and let Marguerite's story carry you gently into sleep. The morning your father announced your fate arrived like any other in your village near Reims, with chickens scratching in the dirt and your mother stirring porridge over the hearth. You sat with your 6 sisters, ranging from little Marie at 5 summers to Elizabeth at 19. When your father, in that particular way that meant important news, his weathered hands trembled slightly as he spoke, explaining that the harvest had failed again, that the Lord demanded higher taxes, and that choices had to be made for the family's survival. You watched his eyes skip over you, the middle daughter, neither pretty enough for a good marriage, nor sturdy enough for farm labor, as he declared you would be given to God at Saint Agnes Abbey. Your mother, weeping silently into her apron, while your sisters stared at their bowls, understanding that your sacrifice meant their survival. The porridge turned to ash in your mouth, as you realized you had just 7 days left in the only world you had ever known. That night, you lay between your sisters for the last time, memorizing the sound of their breathing, the warmth of their bodies pressed against yours, knowing that where you were going, even this simple comfort would be forbidden. The abbey waited 20 miles north, a place you had only heard mentioned in hushed whispers, where women went to die slowly in service to a god who seemed very far from the suffering of peasant girls. The journey to Saint Agnes Abbey began before dawn, on a morning so cold your breath crystallized in the air like tiny prayers made visible. Your father had borrowed the miller's cart, and you sat in the back, among sacks of grain that would serve as your dowry to the convent, payment for taking a mouth he could no longer feed. Your mother had risen even earlier to pack your few possessions, a wooden comb that had belonged to your grandmother, 2 linen shifts sewn by your own hands, and a small wooden cross your youngest sister pressed into your palm at the last moment. The wheels creaked rhythmically as familiar fields gave way to forests you had never seen, each turn taking you further from everything you had ever loved. Your father spoke only once during those long hours, that the nuns would teach you to read, that you would eat every day, that this was better than starving slowly at home. You wanted to scream that you would rather starve with your family than grow fat among strangers, but your throat had closed around words that would change nothing. As the sun reached its peak, the abbey's towers appeared through bare winter trees, like fingers of stone reaching toward a grey sky that seemed to press down upon the earth. The walls rose higher than any building you had ever seen, built from stones that looked cold, even from a distance, promising a fortress not against enemies, but against the very idea of escape. The abbey's entrance gate loomed before you like the mouth of some great beast, waiting to swallow you whole, its iron teeth black with age and rain. A small wooden door set within the larger gate opened with a shriek that sent ravens scattering from the walls, revealing a nun whose face seemed carved from the same grey stone as the building itself. Sister Claudine, the portress, examined you with eyes that had long ago forgotten how to show kindness, taking in your patched dress and thin cloak with a disapproval that needed no words. Your father handled the negotiation quickly, passing over the grain sacks and a small leather pouch that contained what few coins your family had managed to gather. You watched him sign a document he could not read, making his mark with an X, while Sister Claudine's lips pursed as if tasting something sour. The moment ink touched parchment, you belonged to the abbey until death, with no legal right to leave, no claim to inheritance, no existence beyond these walls. Your father turned to you then, and for one moment his mask slipped, revealing such profound guilt that you almost forgave him. His rough hand touched your cheek once, briefly. Then he climbed back onto the cart without looking back. You stood frozen as the gate closed with a finality that resonated in your bones, the last glimpse of your old life disappearing behind iron and oak that would separate you from the world forever. Sister Claudine's fingers dug into your arm like talons as she dragged you through corridors that smelled of damp stone and centuries of prayer, explaining the rules in a voice that suggested she had given this speech too many times to care about the terror in young girls' eyes. You would own nothing, not even the hair on your head, which would be shorn tomorrow, marking you as dead to the world beyond these walls. You would speak only during designated times, and even then only in Latin prayers you did not yet understand, with casual conversation bringing punishment that ranged from reduced food to solitary confinement in cells beneath the abbey. You would wake at midnight for matins, rise again at 3 for lauds, and continue through 8 prayer sessions that divided each day into segments of worship and labour, with no regard for human exhaustion. Your monthly bleeding would be considered unclean, requiring isolation and additional prayers for the sin of being female, though Sister Claudine noted with grim satisfaction that most girls stopped bleeding entirely after a few months of convent rations. You would see your family never again, receive no letters, send no word of whether you lived or died, becoming a ghost haunting stone corridors while still drawing breath. The list continued as you descended stairs worn smooth by centuries of feet, each rule another bar in the cage that would hold you until your bones joined those of countless forgotten women in the crypt below. Dormitories stretched before you like a hall of the dying. 2 rows of narrow beds, separated by a central aisle barely wide enough for one person to pass. 60 women slept here on straw mattresses that rustled with every movement. Their bodies separated by less than an arm's length, yet forbidden to speak or touch each other, even in sleep. Sister Claudine assigned you a bed between a woman who wheezed with each breath, and another whose eyes held the vacant look of someone whose mind had fled to escape what her body could not. The mattress felt like lying on twigs, and when you shifted trying to find a position that did not hurt, tiny black shapes scattered across the rough blanket, bedbugs that would become your constant companions, their bites joining the lice from unwashed bodies and fleas from the straw in a symphony of itching you were forbidden to scratch during prayers. A single window at the far end provided the only light, barred with iron as if the women here were criminals rather than brides of Christ. Though you would soon learn that many sisters had been delivered here for crimes no greater than refusing an unwanted marriage or bearing a child outside wedlock. The woman in the bed to your left turned her head slightly, enough for you to see the purple bruises on her neck, where she had been disciplined for some infraction, her eyes warning you without words that this place consumed women slowly, digesting them over decades until nothing remained but obedience and exhaustion. Your first night shattered around the bell for matins, bronze thunder that seemed to crack the very darkness at 2 hours past midnight. Bodies rose from beds like the dead, responding to judgment, moving with practiced efficiency despite exhaustion that clung to them like burial shrouds. You fumbled in absolute darkness, trying to copy the others as they dressed in silence, your fingers too cold and clumsy to manage the unfamiliar ties and pins of the novice habit Sister Claudine had thrown at you before disappearing. The woman from the neighbouring bed reached over, breaking the rule of no contact, to help you with a speed that spoke of muscle memory rather than kindness, her fingers ice against your neck as she adjusted your veil. The procession to the chapel moved through corridors lit only by 2 candles at the front and back of the line, 60 women navigating by memory and the shuffle of feet on stone. You stumbled repeatedly, earning sharp intakes of breath from those behind you, each misstep marking you as the outsider who would slow their practiced rhythm. The chapel itself offered no warmth, despite the bodies packed within, your breath visible in the candlelight as you knelt on stone that seemed to leach heat from your bones. The Latin prayers began immediately, voices joining in a chant you could not follow. Words that meant nothing to you beyond the understanding that this would be your life now, rising in darkness, kneeling until your legs went numb, returning to bed only to be woken again in what felt like moments for the next office of prayer. Dawn brought no relief, only a bell summoning you to prime prayers, followed immediately by a breakfast that mocked the very concept of sustenance. The refectory stretched long and narrow, its tables scarred by centuries of use, where you learned that speaking during meals meant losing even this meagre portion. Each sister received a single piece of black bread, hard as stone, and speckled with what you hoped was grain, but suspected might be less wholesome additions, alongside a bowl of pottage that seemed to be water, flavoured with the memory of vegetables. You watched the others soak their bread in the thin liquid, trying to soften it enough to chew without breaking teeth already loosened by malnutrition. The woman across from you, Sister Therese, had gums that bled freely as she ate, staining her bread pink before each bite, a condition the infirmarian dismissed as God's will rather than the scurvy it clearly was. Your stomach, accustomed to peasant fare that at least filled if not nourished, cramped around this offering that would need to sustain you until the single meal at midday. Some sisters had already learned to catch and eat the mice that ran along the walls, cooking them over candle flames in secret moments, risking punishment for the protein that might keep them alive another winter. You forced down every crumb, every drop, knowing that pride would kill you faster than hunger, in this place where survival meant accepting degradation as a form of worship. After breakfast came your formal introduction to the reality of monastic labour, work that began where prayer ended and continued until your body simply could not move anymore. Sister Claudine assigned you to the laundry, a stone building attached to the main abbey, where steam rose from massive copper vats that required constant feeding with wood you would also have to chop. The lye soap burned through skin within minutes of contact, leaving your hands raw and weeping before the first hour ended. Wounds that would never fully heal in the constant cycle of washing. You learned to stir sheets and habits in boiling water with wooden poles longer than you were tall, the steam leaving you drenched in sweat, even as winter wind howled through gaps in the walls. The work was assigned based on a hierarchy you did not yet understand. Newer sisters, and those who had earned displeasure, handling the worst tasks, while senior nuns supervised from chairs, their main contribution being criticism when you failed to remove stains that had set into fabric years before you arrived. Your back screamed from bending over wash basins, scrubbing cloth against stone until your arms trembled with exhaustion, knowing that incompletely cleaned items would mean doing them again plus whatever punishment the supervising sister felt appropriate. By the time the bell rang for sext prayers at midday, your novice habit was soaked through with water and sweat, clinging to your body in ways that would earn rebuke for immodesty if anyone cared enough to notice one more suffering girl among dozens. The midday meal arrived with ceremony that seemed to mock its meager contents, as one sister read from sacred texts, while the rest ate their portion of thin vegetable soup and a thumb-sized piece of cheese that had seen better days several weeks ago. You sat at the lowest table, with other newcomers, and those deemed unworthy of better placement, where the soup arrived last and coolest. Any trace of fat or substance already claimed by those who ate first. The reading droned on about the glory of suffering for Christ, how hunger brought one closer to God while your stomach twisted around emptiness that no amount of prayer would fill. You noticed how the older sisters had developed a way of eating that stretched the meal impossibly long, taking tiny sips and chewing each morsel until it dissolved, making their portions last the entire reading to trick their bodies into feeling fuller. Sister Marie, barely 16 and here only 2 months longer than you, had already lost enough weight that her habit hung loose, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, the early signs of the wasting that claimed so many young nuns before their 20th year. When she reached for a piece of bread that had fallen to the floor, the reading sister struck her hand with a wooden rod, without pausing in her recitation, the crack echoing off stone walls, while Marie cradled her fingers, and the bread remained where it lay. Food for rats rather than desperate girls. The afternoon brought your introduction to the scriptorium. Though you could not read the Latin text, you would spend countless hours copying. Sister Augustina, the scriptoria mistress, possessed the rare ability to read and write, skills she wielded like weapons against the ignorant girls under her supervision. Your task involved preparing parchment, a process that began with scraping animal skins with curved blades until they reached the perfect thinness, any error meaning the waste of valuable material, and punishment that ranged from missed meals to beatings. The smell of the preparation room made your empty stomach heave, rotting flesh, lye, and excrement used in the treatment process, all contained in a windowless chamber where you would spend 6 hours each day. You learned to identify which skins would take ink properly, which had too many scars or insect damage to be useful for important texts, sorting materials while your untrained fingers bled from countless small cuts. The senior scribes worked in a separate room with actual windows and braziers for warmth, their skilled hands creating illuminated manuscripts that would sell for enough gold to feed the entire convent for months, though the sisters who created them would never see a single extra crumb for their artistry. Your bleeding fingers marked each piece of parchment you touched, pink stains that would need to be bleached out, more work to fix your mistakes, an endless cycle of failure and punishment that seemed designed to break spirits rather than create beauty. Vespers arrived as the winter sun died behind abbey walls, casting the chapel into shadows that seemed to swallow light rather than simply absence it. Your knees, already bruised from morning prayers, screamed as they met stone again, a pain that would become so constant you would eventually forget what it felt like to kneel without agony. The evening prayers stretched longer than morning ones, 2 full hours of Latin you could not understand, your mouth moving in mimicry of sounds that might have been prayers or curses for all you knew. Sister Beatrice, kneeling beside you, suddenly pitched forward, her body striking the floor with a that echoed through the chapel. No one moved to help her, the prayers continuing without pause while she lay unconscious, a trickle of blood from where her head had struck stone pooling in the grooves between tiles. Only after the final Amen did two sisters drag her from the chapel, her feet leaving twin trails through the blood, and you heard later she had died in the night from a growth in her brain that had been killing her slowly for months. This was how death came to the abbey, quietly, without ceremony, bodies failing during prayer or work until they simply stopped, replaced the next day by another desperate girl whose family could not feed her. You wondered if your father would ever know when you died, if anyone would send word, or if you would simply vanish from the world's memory as completely as Sister Beatrice, whose bed already held a new occupant by the next evening. Your education in reading began not as promised enlightenment, but as another form of torment, with Sister Augustina teaching Latin through beatings that left your hands too swollen to hold a quill properly. The classroom, a cramped chamber below the scriptorium, held 12 girls ranging from your age to some barely 8 years old, all struggling to memorize prayers in a language that existed nowhere in their lives except these walls. The youngest, Catherine, had been delivered to the abbey at 6, and at 8 still wet herself during lessons from fear when Sister Augustina's rod whoosh whistled through the air. You learned that mistakes meant not just pain but humiliation. Errors in pronunciation required kneeling on dried beans for hours, while failure to memorize assigned texts meant standing with arms outstretched holding heavy psalters until muscles gave out and sacred books thud crashed to the floor, earning further punishment for damaging holy texts. The letters swam before your eyes, made harder by the single candle that provided light for all 12 students, forcing you to squint until headaches became your constant companion. You discovered that some girls had been studying for years without progressing, their minds unable or unwilling to accept this foreign tongue, trapped in an endless cycle of lessons they could not master, and punishments for failures that were inevitable. When Sister Augustina finally dismissed you after 3 hours, your hands bore welts that would make tomorrow's writing lesson agony, a deliberate cruelty that ensured suffering compounded daily. The first time you witnessed a public discipline, the entire convent gathered in the courtyard, despite snow falling thick enough to obscure the walls merely 20 feet away. Sister Margaret had been caught with a letter from her sister in the outside world, smuggled in by a tradesman who took pity on a woman 20 years imprisoned. And now she would pay for that moment of human connection. The abbess read the charges in a voice that carried over wind, declaring that Sister Margaret had broken her vows of separation from the world, had endangered the spiritual purity of the entire community, and would receive 40 lashes to purify her soul. They stripped her to the waist in the freezing air, her back already bearing scars from previous punishments, skin blue-white with cold before the first strike landed. The whip, leather strips embedded with small metal rings, tore flesh with each strike, while the assembled nuns were forced to watch, some praying, others standing with the vacant expressions of those who had seen too much suffering to feel any more. You counted each lash, watching Sister Margaret's body jerk and twist, blood spattering the snow in patterns that looked almost decorative, while beside you a younger nun retching vomited, earning herself a week of reduced rations for showing weakness. After 20 lashes, Sister Margaret stopped screaming, hanging limp from the post, but the punishment continued to its completion, teaching lessons about obedience to those still capable of learning. They left her tied there for an hour after, blood freezing on her back, before carrying her to the infirmary, where she would either survive or not, God's will determining whether the lesson required her death. Spring arrived with no fanfare inside walls where seasons meant only changes in the type of misery endured. Though now, the endless rain brought new challenges, as water seeped through ancient stones. The dormitory ceiling developed leaks that drip, 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 steadily onto beds, forcing you to sleep in wetness that bred coughs that, coughing, hacking, rattled through the night like death's own symphony. Your assigned labor shifted to the gardens, where you learned that the vegetables you grew would grace the abbess's table and be sold at market, while you and your sisters continued to subsist on the same thin soup made from scraps even pigs might refuse. The ground, saturated with rain and still half-frozen beneath, required breaking with tools that seemed designed for hands twice your size, blisters forming and bursting within hours, leaving raw flesh to grip wooden handles, slick with blood and rain. Sister Joan, working beside you, collapsed into the mud, her body convulsing with fever that had been building for days, ignored because illness was seen as either God's test or punishment, never simply what happened when malnourished bodies worked past exhaustion in freezing rain. They carried her to the infirmary, that chamber of last hopes where more sisters died than recovered. Herbs and prayer, the only medicine available to women whose suffering was considered holy. You continued working as they took her away, understanding now that your body was merely a tool to be used until it broke, then discarded for the next girl whose family could not feed her. The feast of Easter should have brought celebration, but in the Abbey it meant only longer prayers and the same meagre rations disguised as voluntary fasting for the glory of God. While the outside world celebrated resurrection, you knelt for 6 consecutive hours on Good Friday, your knees beyond pain into a numbness that suggested permanent damage, blood seeping through your habit where skin had worn away entirely. The Passion Play performed by senior sisters depicted Christ's suffering in detail that seemed redundant when surrounded by women who suffered daily, though none dared voice such blasphemy. You watched Sister Catherine, the 8-year-old, struggling to stay conscious during the endless liturgy, her small body swaying dangerously, but any attempt to help her would bring punishment to both of you. The Easter vigil lasted through the entire night, candles burning down to nothing, while voices grew hoarse from constant chanting, the Latin words becoming meaningless sounds that might have been spells or curses, for all the good they did your growling stomach. When dawn finally came, bringing Easter Sunday, the promised feast consisted of an extra piece of bread and a boiled egg per sister, luxury that some women sobbing wept to receive, having forgotten what actual food tasted like. You ate your eggs slowly, shell and all, having learned that calcium might help the teeth you felt loosening in your gums. While around you sisters savoured this annual reminder that somewhere beyond these walls, people ate their fill every day. Summer brought heat that transformed the stone abbey into an oven where habits became instruments of torture, wool holding sweat and smell until you could taste the stench of your own body rotting in the heat. Bathing was permitted once monthly if you were fortunate, a communal humiliation where elderly sisters watched to ensure no one touched their own body more than necessary for cleaning, pleasure of any kind being the gravest sin. The bath water, shared by a dozen women in sequence, turned grey, then brown, then black, the last to bathe essentially coating themselves in the accumulated filth of others. You learned to volunteer for the hardest garden work to earn the privilege of bathing first, though even clean water could not wash away the lice that had colonized every fold of fabric and flesh, their eggs embedded so deeply that only burning the habits would truly eliminate them. Sister Frances had scratched her scalp bloody trying to relieve the itching, earning penance for the sin of vanity, as if wanting relief from parasites was somehow prideful. The heat made the smell of the latrines unbearable, the waste of 60 women fermenting in pits that were emptied twice yearly, flies thick enough to darken windows carrying disease from the waste to the kitchens where food was prepared. Disgusted. You developed the skill of breathing through your mouth, though this brought its own problems as the flies would land on your tongue during prayers, their feet carrying tastes you tried not to identify. The arrival of your first monthly blood in the convent brought not the private embarrassment you had expected, but public shame that seemed designed to remind you that being female was itself a sin, requiring constant penance. Sister Claudine announced your condition to the entire refectory, declaring you unclean and therefore banned from touching holy objects, preparing food, or entering the chapel proper for 7 days. They moved you to the isolation cells, stone chambers barely large enough to lie down, where bleeding women were segregated like lepers, provided with rough cloth that chafed raw skin and a bucket that was emptied once daily if you were fortunate. The cramps that twisted your insides received no sympathy or relief, pain being woman's punishment for Eve's sin, though you noticed the abbess somehow never seemed to suffer these monthly exiles. her position apparently elevating her above biological functions. You lay on stone that offered no comfort to aching bones, listening to another woman in an adjacent cell weeping from pain while rats investigated the bloody cloths, bold enough in these forgotten chambers to climb over your body in search of sustenance. The isolation might have been bearable if not for the hunger, as unclean women received half rations, your body being punished for performing its natural function, while simultaneously being denied the nutrition needed to survive the blood loss. When you finally emerged after 7 days, weak and filthy, you understood why so many sisters eventually stopped bleeding entirely, their bodies choosing survival over fertility in this place where creating life was the ultimate sin. The death of Sister Joan from the fever she had caught in the spring gardens came during non-prayers, her rattling breath finally ceasing mid-chant while the rest of you continued singing as required. They left her body in the chapel until prayers concluded, her corpse cooling among the living who stepped over her to exit, death having become so commonplace that it warranted no special acknowledgement. You helped prepare her body for burial, stripping the habit that would be washed and given to the next novice, revealing a skeleton wrapped in skin covered with bed sores and the marks of countless punishments. The burial took place before Compline in the cemetery behind the abbey, where wooden crosses had long ago rotted away, leaving unmarked mounds that shifted with each rain, bones occasionally surfacing like accusations from the earth. Sister Joan received no eulogy beyond a brief prayer in Latin, her name already being erased from memory, her bed filled that very night by a new girl whose terrified eyes reminded you of your own arrival 6 months ago. The gravediggers, 2 elderly sisters who had outlived all their contemporaries through pure spite, gossiped while shoveling dirt, estimating that 300 women lay beneath this small plot. Generations of forgotten daughters whose families never knew their fate. You stood in the gathering darkness, watching dirt cover Sister Joan's face, wondering if your mother ever thought of you, if your sisters remembered your name, if anyone in the world beyond these walls would notice when your turn came to join this anonymous congregation of the dead. The harvest season meant working from dawn until well past dark in fields that belonged to the abbey, but whose bounty would never touch your lips. You pulled vegetables from earth you had prepared with your blood and sweat, loading carts that would travel to market, where the abbess's representatives would sell them for coins that bought comfort for the few, while the many continued to starve. Your hands, already destroyed from months of lie and labor, split open anew on thistle and thorn, infection setting into cuts that never had time to heal before the next day's work tore them open again. Sister Agnes, working beside you, suddenly screamed and fell, a scythe having slipped and opened her leg from knee to ankle, blood pooling faster than the dry earth could absorb it. They carried her to the infirmary where the wound was packed with dirty cloth and prayed over, no one possessing the knowledge to properly clean or stitch such an injury, leaving infection as certain as sunrise. You continued harvesting as her screams echoed from the infirmary windows, understanding that stopping work for any reason meant reduced rations for everyone, the abbess having perfected a system where sisters policed each other through collective punishment. By evening, your back felt permanently bent, muscles seized into positions that would eventually become permanent. The elderly sisters you saw shuffling through corridors, showing your future in their twisted spines. The harvest moon rose full and bright, but you were too exhausted to appreciate its beauty. Falling onto your flea-infested mattress, still wearing your sweat-soaked habit, too tired to care about the insects that immediately began their nightly feast. The first signs of the pestilence arrived with merchants who came to collect the harvest. Their leader, as he haggled with the abbess's treasurer over prices. Within days, Sister Catherine, who had served them bread, developed the fever and swellings in her neck that marked the beginning of the end. The abbess ordered the sick isolated, but in a community where 60 women shared everything from sleeping quarters to washing water, containment was impossible. You watched the disease spread like fire through dry grass, taking the weakest first, the elderly, the malnourished, those already weakened by other illnesses. The infirmary overflowed within a week, 6 sisters lying in corridors, their creating a constant background chorus to prayers that continued despite half the choir being absent. Sister Claudine, who had tormented you since arrival, died on her own blood, her authority meaning nothing to the democracy of disease. The abbess fled to her private chambers, claiming spiritual retreat, but actually barricading herself with the abbey's food stores while her flock died unattended. You developed the fever on the 10th day, your neck swelling with buboes that felt like burning coals beneath your skin, understanding that you would likely be dead within days, like the 20 sisters already being buried in mass graves. Yet somehow, through providence or curse, your fever broke after 3 days, leaving you weak but alive, while others continued to die around you, condemned to survive in this place that had become more cemetery than convent. By winter, half the convent lay dead, their bodies burned in pyres when the frozen ground became too hard for burial. You survived, scarred and changed, moving through halls that echoed with absence, where once they had hummed with prayer. The few merchants brave enough to trade with the abbey spoke of entire villages emptied, of cities where corpses outnumbered the living, of a world transformed by death into something unrecognizable. The abbess emerged from her self-imposed isolation only after the disease had burned itself out, finding her authority diminished among the 30 sisters who remained, women who had seen her cowardice and would not forget. Your daily routine continued with mechanical persistence. Prayers, work, meals. But with so few hands, the elaborate ceremonies collapsed into simple survival. The gardens grew wild, the scriptorium stood empty, and the laundry reduced to washing only what was absolutely necessary. You found yourself assigned to the kitchens, cooking for 30 instead of 60, though the portions remained the same, the abbess ensuring that suffering continued, even when practical reasons for it had died with half the community. At night, you lay in a dormitory where every other bed stood empty, personal belongings of the dead still tucked beneath mattresses, because no one had the energy to clear them. Sometimes you heard crying from the darkness, survivors mourning not just the dead, but the realization that they had been left behind in this prison, while death had offered others escape. Spring brought not renewal, but the revelation of how thoroughly the plague had broken the abbey's economy. With no one left to work the fields, and few merchants willing to risk trading with a place marked by death, the abbess announced new austerities, as if life could become harder than it already was, reducing meals to once daily, and eliminating the brief rest periods between prayers and work. You learned to chew leather when hunger became unbearable, softening strips cut from old sandals in water, before gnawing them like a dog with a bone, the action providing the illusion of eating, even if no nutrition came from it. Sister Therese, driven mad by hunger and isolation, began eating dirt from the garden, claiming God told her it would sustain her, and no one had energy to stop her even when she began vomiting blood. The younger girls who had survived the plague aged rapidly, childhood burning away in the crucible of starvation and overwork, their eyes holding knowledge that should never burden children. You watched Catherine, now 9, methodically catching and eating spiders, her small fingers quick and precise, survival instincts overcoming any squeamishness she might once have possessed. When a merchant's horse died in the courtyard, you joined the desperate feast, pulling raw meat from bones while it was still warm, blood running down your chin as you ate like the animal hunger had made you. The abbess watched from her window, making no move to stop you, perhaps understanding that preventing this meal would mean more deaths, and 30 sisters were barely enough to maintain even the pretense of a functioning convent. The arrival of new novices in summer should have brought relief, But the 7 girls delivered to the abbey were refugees from families destroyed by plague, not daughters given with dowries, but mouths disposed of by desperate relatives. The abbess accepted them anyway, needing bodies to work even if they brought nothing but their hunger. You were assigned to train them, though you had been here barely a year yourself, the rapid deaths having promoted you to senior status by simple survival. Teaching these hollow-eyed children, the rules felt like preparing lambs for slaughter, especially the youngest, barely 7, who cried constantly for a mother who had died vomiting black blood. You showed them the dormitory where they would never sleep enough, the chapel where they would kneel until their knees bled, the refectory where they would learn that hunger was their most faithful companion. One girl, Margaret, perhaps 12, looked at the meagre portion of gruel and asked when the real food would arrive, not understanding that this was all there would ever be. You wanted to warn them to run, to take their chances in the plague-emptied world, rather than die slowly here. But the words died in your throat, because where would they go? The world outside offered different deaths, but death nonetheless. And at least here they would have shelter and the promise of heaven, even if both came at the cost of everything that made life worth living. That night, listening to their terrified whispers in the darkness, you remembered your own first night and realized you had become Sister Claudine, perpetuating the very system that was killing you. The feast day of Saint Agnes, the abbey's patron, arrived with bitter irony as you participated in ceremonies celebrating a virgin martyr while surrounded by women dying slower deaths for no crime but being born female and poor. The abbess ordered special preparations, despite having no resources, commanding decorations made from wildflowers that you gathered while fainting from hunger, beauty constructed from the labor of the starving. The bishop arrived for the celebration, fat and red-faced from good wine, his retinue carrying provisions that made your mouth water, white bread, wheels of cheese, barrels of ale that would never touch your lips. You stood in choir as he celebrated Mass, his Latin pronunciation so different from what you had learned that the prayers sounded like another language entirely, his gold-threaded vestments worth enough to feed the entire convent for years. After the service, he dined with the abbess, while you and your sisters were given an extra crust of bread and told to be grateful for this bounty. Through the refectory windows, you could see them eating roasted fowl, the smell of meat driving some sisters to tears, while others stood in angry silence that felt more dangerous than any plague. Sister Therese, her madness advancing, began laughing during evening prayers, declaring that Saint Agnes was fortunate to die young rather than rot slowly like the rest of you, earning a beating that she seemed not to feel, continuing to laughing even as blood ran from her mouth. That night, you dreamed of martyrdom, not the glorious kind that earned sainthood, but the mundane version you lived daily, dying by degrees for a God who seemed to have forgotten you existed. Autumn brought the death of the youngest novice, the 7-year-old who had never stopped crying for her mother, her small body finally surrendering to the combination of starvation, cold, and despair that the abbey specialized in delivering. You found her curled in her bed like a baby seeking warmth that would never come, her face peaceful in death as it had never been in life. The burial felt different from the others, perhaps because she was so young, or perhaps because you had been responsible for her training and felt the weight of having taught her to suffer rather than protecting her. Even the abbess seemed affected, though not enough to change anything, merely commenting that softly God must have wanted another angel, while you bit your tongue to keep from screaming that God seemed to want too many angels from the ranks of poor girls. Margaret, the 12-year-old who had asked about real food, stopped eating entirely after her friend's death, a slow suicide that the abbey pretended was holy fasting. You tried to force her to eat, understanding now why Sister Claudine had been so harsh, not from cruelty, but from the terrible knowledge that kindness killed faster than severity in this place. The cemetery behind the abbey gained another small mound, unmarked like all the others, while the living continued their slow march toward joining her. That night, for the first time since arriving, you did not pray during compline, your mouth moving through the motions, while your mind wondered if the child was truly in heaven, or if that too was a lie told to make the unbearable bearable. Winter arrived with a brutality that seemed personal, winds howling through gaps in stone that had widened over centuries of neglect, snow drifting through windows whose shutters had rotted away unreplaced. The dormitory became a place of communal survival, as the remaining sisters huddled together for warmth, despite rules forbidding physical contact, choosing potential punishment over certain death from freezing. Your habit, threadbare from constant washing and wear, provided no protection against cold that seemed to seep into your bones and live there, a constant ache that made every movement agony. 3 sisters died in their sleep during one particularly vicious night, their bodies frozen to their mattresses, requiring hot water to separate corpse from bed. The water in the chapel font froze solid. Communion wine turned to slush, and still the prayers continued, words emerging in puffs of visible breath, while fingers too numb to feel clutched at prayer books. You discovered that Margaret had died during matins, her decision to stop eating having weakened her too much to survive the cold, her body remaining upright in the chapel pew, frozen in place as if still praying. The ground was too frozen for burial, so bodies were stacked in an outbuilding, awaiting spring thaw, their presence a constant reminder that death was the only certain escape from this place. You began to envy them, these sisters who had found release, while you continued to wake each morning, condemned to survive what others could not endure. The miracle of your survival through another winter felt more like a curse as spring revealed the full extent of the damage. Only 22 sisters remained of the 60 who had been here when you arrived less than 2 years ago. The abbess, perhaps finally understanding that her workforce was dying faster than it could be replaced, slightly increased rations, though the improvement from starvation to mere severe hunger felt like a feast. You were assigned to help the infirmarian, though this meant little more than watching sisters die with slightly more comfort, applying herbs that did nothing to wounds that wouldn't heal on bodies too malnourished to fight infection. Sister Therese's madness had progressed to the point where she believed she was the Virgin Mary, blessing the other sisters with touches that left bloody handprints from her constantly bleeding palms, self-inflicted stigmata that she refreshed nightly with a stolen knife. No one stopped her anymore, madness having become so common that it was merely another variation of the suffering everyone endured. You learned to identify the stages of death by smell, the sweet rot of infected wounds, the sour stench of bodies consuming themselves, the peculiar odor that preceded death by hours, allowing you to summon the abbess for last rites. The infirmary became your world, a kingdom of the dying where you reigned as a queen of futile gestures, holding hands as spirits fled bodies that had become prisons, whispering lies about heaven to women who had lived through hell. The arrival of a papal inspector in early summer should have brought hope for reform, but Brother Francis proved more interested in ensuring the abbey's taxes were paid than investigating why so many sisters had died. He examined the account books while ignoring the skeletal women who served him, calculating the value of vegetables never grown and manuscripts never completed, while stepping over sisters too weak to rise from where they had fallen. You watched him tour the scriptorium, now empty of workers, annoyed, complaining about lost revenue rather than lost lives, his well-fed face showing disgust not at the conditions but at the failure to meet production quotas. The abbess, displaying more backbone than you had ever seen, actually argued with him, pointing out that dead women could not work, but he merely suggested recruiting from the orphanages overflowing with plague orphans, treating symptoms rather than the disease. During his inspection of the dormitory, Sister Therese approached him with her bleeding hands, trying to bless him, and he recoiled in horror, ordering her confined, despite the abbess's explanation that they lacked the personnel to guard anyone. His final report, which you glimpsed while cleaning his chambers, recommended closing the abbey unless productivity improved within the year, a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic indifference. After he left, the abbess gathered the survivors, her face showing defeat for the first time. Cards, admitting that without workers or dowries, the abbey would likely close, leaving all of you to face a world that had no place for women, with no families, no skills beyond prayer, and bodies broken by years of deprivation. The summer heat brought plague again, though this time it moved slowly through bodies already so damaged that the disease seemed almost merciful compared to the daily suffering. You recognized the symptoms in yourself, the fever, the swellings, the certainty of death approaching, but felt only relief that your ordeal was finally ending. The infirmary filled again, though, with so few sisters remaining, there were beds enough for all who sickened. The abbess herself fell ill, her private chambers no protection against disease carried by the fleas that infested every corner of the abbey. You lay in your infirmary bed, watching Sister Therese continue her mad ministrations to the dying, her bloody hands leaving marks on foreheads she blessed, a lunatic angel in a ward of the damned. The youngest surviving novice, now 8, brought water with hands that shook from fever. Children caring for the dying because all the adults were dying themselves. You drifted in and out of consciousness, fever dreams mixing with reality until you couldn't distinguish between visions of hell and the actual infirmary. Yet somehow, impossibly, your fever broke again, your body refusing to grant you the escape it had given others. You woke to find half the remaining sisters dead, the abbess among them, her authority passing to Sister Benedict, who had survived simply by outlasting everyone else. The abbey now held 12 living souls in buildings meant for 60, echoing with emptiness that felt like the world itself had ended, leaving only you and a handful of others to witness its corpse. Autumn arrived to find the abbey barely functional. 12 women attempting to maintain buildings and routines designed for 5 times their number. Sister Benedict, the new abbess by default rather than election, abandoned all pretense of the strict schedule, allowing survivors to sleep past matins if it meant they could work the next day. You found yourself in the surreal position of being one of the senior sisters, at barely 16, teaching the 2 surviving novices prayers you barely understood yourself. The harvest was a mockery. A few vegetables gathered from gardens mostly reclaimed by weeds, not enough to feed the survivors through winter, much less generate income. The bishop sent word that the abbey would be dissolved after winter, its lands given to a men's monastery that could properly manage them. The surviving sisters to be distributed to other convents, like unwanted furniture. You felt nothing at this news, your capacity for emotion having been burned away by 2 years of unrelenting suffering. The daily routine continued from habit rather than purpose. Prayers mumbled by exhausted voices, meals of whatever could be found, work that seemed pointless when performed by so few hands. Sister Therese had finally died, her madness ending when she reopened her stigmata too deeply, bleeding out while declaring herself assumed into heaven. You helped bury her in the overcrowded cemetery, her grave unmarked, like all the others, wondering if her madness had been a mercy, allowing her to escape reality while her body remained trapped. As winter approached, you knew most of you would not survive to see the abbey's dissolution, the building itself outlasting its inhabitants. The first snow came early, before you had gathered enough wood for winter, and you knew with cold certainty that this would be the Abbey's last season. Sister Benedict made the decision to abandon most of the buildings, consolidating the 12 survivors into the kitchen and one corner of the dormitory, the only spaces small enough to heat with the little fuel available. You moved through empty halls that echoed with memories of suffering, gathering anything that could burn: furniture, doors, even some of the wooden crosses from the cemetery, the dead having no more need of markers. The chapel was abandoned entirely, its vast space impossible to warm, prayers now conducted in the kitchen, where at least the cooking fire provided some heat. You had become the informal leader of the survivors through the simple virtue of being mobile and somewhat sane, making decisions that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. When the food stores ran low in November, you authorized eating the seed grain meant for spring planting, knowing there would be no spring planting, no future beyond surviving the next day. The 2 youngest novices died within days of each other, their bodies too small to generate enough heat despite huddling with others, leaving 10 of you to face the deepest winter. You stopped bothering with formal prayers, instead sitting in silence around the fire, each woman lost in her own thoughts, or memories, or madness, waiting for an end that seemed to approach with each snowfall. By December, only 8 remained, and you had stopped counting the days, time becoming meaningless when each moment was merely another step toward an inevitable end. The kitchen fire burned constantly, fed with psalters and holy books that would have earned terrible punishment once, but now seemed the most practical use for words that had brought no comfort. Sister Benedict had developed a cough that rattled like bones, spending her days staring into the fire, while blood occasionally spotted her lips. You ventured out daily to gather snow for water, the well having frozen solid, each journey into the cold feeling like it might be your last. The remaining food consisted of leather boiled into a gel-like substance, flour scraped from corners of empty barrels mixed with sawdust to provide bulk if not nutrition, and the occasional rat foolish enough to venture near your traps. One morning, you found Sister Agnes frozen in the corridor, having wandered from the kitchen in the night for reasons that died with her, her body so rigid it took 3 of you to carry her to the pile of corpses in the sealed chapel. The world outside had forgotten you existed, no merchants coming, no messages from the bishop about the promised dissolution, as if the abbey had already passed from reality into legend. You sat with the other survivors, no longer even sisters but simply dying animals, sharing warmth, the pretense of religious life abandoned completely in favor of the basic biological imperative to continue breathing for one more day. January brought a blizzard that sealed the abbey completely, snow drifting higher than the ground floor windows, trapping the 7 survivors in a tomb of ice and stone. Sister Benedict died during the storm, her coughing finally ceasing mid-breath, and you left her body where it fell, lacking the energy to move her and seeing no point when you would all soon join her. The fire grew smaller daily as the fuel ran out, forcing you to burn the last of the furniture, then the wooden rosaries, then strips of cloth torn from the habits of the dead. Food became a memory, your body consuming itself, ribs visible through skin that had taken on a grey pallor like the stone walls surrounding you. 2 more sisters died in their sleep, peacefully, and you envied them the gentleness of their passing, while you continued to wake each morning, cursed with a resilience you had never wanted. Only 4 of you remained by month's end, huddled so close to the dying fire that your habits occasionally caught flame, though none of you moved quickly anymore, reaction times slowed by starvation and cold. You had stopped speaking entirely, communication reduced to looks and gestures, words requiring energy none of you possessed. The howling wind outside sounded like the voices of all the dead sisters, hundreds of women who had suffered and died in this place, and sometimes you thought you could distinguish individual voices. Sister Claudine, Sister Joan, little Catherine who had died crying for her mother. February arrived, though you only knew this from scratching marks on the wall, the blizzard having ended but snow still blocking all exits, winter refusing to release its grip on the abbey that had become your tomb. 3 of you remain now, the 4th having simply stopped breathing while sitting at the fire, remaining upright for hours before anyone noticed. You had begun hallucinating from starvation, seeing people who weren't there, hearing conversations in empty rooms, the boundary between life and death seeming increasingly meaningless. The youngest survivor, barely 13, had begun eating the plaster from the walls, claiming it tasted like bread, her mind having fled to somewhere kinder than reality. The fire died completely on a night when the wind screamed like all the demons of hell, and you lacked the strength to relight it, the 3 of you pressing together for warmth that your bodies could no longer generate. You felt your feet dying first, then your fingers, frostbite claiming extremities while you watched with detached interest, pain having become so constant that its variations barely registered. Morning came, to find the youngest dead, frozen with plaster still in her mouth, leaving only you and Sister Mary, who had stopped responding to anything, sitting upright, but gone somewhere deep inside herself. You sat in the absolute silence of the dead abbey, no longer cold, no longer hungry, no longer anything but a consciousness trapped in a failing body, waiting for a release that seemed to take forever to arrive. Time ceased to have meaning in the frozen abbey, where you sat with Sister Mary's corpse, unsure how long she had been dead, unsure if you were still alive yourself, or had passed into some purgatory that looked exactly like the hell you had been living. Your body had stopped feeling anything below your chest, legs blackened with frostbite, though you felt no urgency about this development. Death, having become a friend you were waiting to embrace. The hallucinations had become your only company. Your sisters from home appeared, unchanged by time, asking why you had left them, and you tried to explain, but your voice had forgotten how to form words. Your mother sat beside you, young as you remembered her, weeping for what you had become, and you wanted to comfort her, but your arms would not move. Days or weeks passed in this dreamlike state, your mind wandering through memories while your body remained frozen in place, a statue of suffering that would be found when spring finally came. You remembered your father's face the day he left you here, the guilt in his eyes, and you forgave him, understanding that he had chosen between terrible options, sacrificing one daughter so others might live. The abbey bells rang in your delirium, calling sisters to prayers that would never again be said, and you saw them all processing through the kitchen. 60 women restored to health, moving toward a chapel filled with light. You tried to follow, but your body was too heavy, made of stone like the walls that had imprisoned you, and you understood that you were becoming part of the abbey itself. Another ghost, haunting these halls. Spring came as distant sounds of dripping water, the snow melting from the roof, though you could no longer turn your head to look toward the windows. Your body had become a prison within a prison, only your eyes still capable of movement, watching dust motes dance in a shaft of sunlight that had found its way through the ice. You were no longer Marguerite, but something else, a consciousness observing the slow decay of flesh that had once been yours, fascinated by the patterns of frost on dead skin, the way fingernails continued growing after everything else had stopped. Voices reached you from somewhere far away. Men's voices speaking in the local dialect rather than Latin, probably come to claim the abbey's lands now that winter was ending. They would find you here, a tableau of suffering that would shock them for a moment, before they began calculating the value of what could be salvaged. You wanted to warn them that the abbey was cursed, that it consumed women, slowly grinding them to nothing between the millstones of faith and poverty. But your mouth had forgotten its purpose. The voices grew closer, and you heard them breaking down the door blocked by snow, their casual conversation about the weather, seeming absurd in this place where weather had been one more instrument of torture. Soon they would find you, and you would become a story told in taverns, the nun who survived everyone else only to die alone, though they would never understand that surviving had been the cruelest fate of all. The men who found you recoiled in horror, crossing themselves and backing away as if you were a demon rather than a dying girl, though you understood their fear when you glimpsed your reflection in a copper pot. Skeletal, blackened with frostbite, more corpse than human. They debated whether you were alive, one insisting he saw your eyes move, another declaring it impossible that anyone could survive in such conditions. The bishop's representative, a young priest who vomited upon entering the kitchen full of corpses, finally approached close enough to see your chest's shallow movement. They carried you from the abbey on a plank, your body too damaged to bend, laying you in a cart among the salvaged valuables, candlesticks, the better vestments, anything that could be sold. The journey to the nearest town passed in a haze of sky and trees you had not seen in 2 years. Beauty that hurt more than any physical pain, because it reminded you of everything stolen from you. The townspeople gathered to stare at the survivor from the cursed abbey, mothers pulling children away from the cart, whispers following your passage about the hundreds of women who had died behind those walls. They brought you to another convent, claiming the sisters there would care for you, though you wanted to scream that you had escaped one prison only to be delivered to another. The new abbess looked at you with pity rather than compassion, already calculating whether you would recover enough to work, or would simply be another mouth to feed until death finally claimed you. The infirmary of the new convent was paradise compared to what you had known. Actual beds with clean straw, windows that opened, sisters who brought food 3 times daily, even if you could barely swallow. They cut away your frostbitten toes and fingers with surprising gentleness. The pain nothing compared to what you had endured, your body too damaged to properly feel any more. Sister Catherine, the infirmarian, was young and had trained with actual physicians before taking vows, approaching your care with medical knowledge rather than just prayer. She spoke to you constantly as she worked, explaining that she was trying to save your legs, that you wanted to tell her there was no point, that you had already died, back in that frozen kitchen, and this was just your body catching up. Slowly, against your will, you began to heal. Flesh returning to bones. Color replacing the grey of near death, though your hands and feet would never be whole again. Other sisters visited, curious about the survivor from Saint Agnes, asking questions you could not answer because your voice had forgotten how to form words after months of silence. They meant well, these women who had never known true hunger, never watched sisters die daily, never burned holy books for warmth, but their kindness felt like judgment of what you had done to survive. At night, you lay in the clean bed, missing the familiar misery of Saint Agnes, feeling guilty for every moment of comfort, as if enjoying warmth and food betrayed the hundreds who had died without either. Summer found you able to walk again, though, lurching on feet missing toes, hands barely able to grip with only thumb and 2 fingers remaining on each. The abbess decided you would work in the gardens, perhaps thinking outdoor labor would complete your healing, not understanding that gardens would forever remind you of Sister Joan dying in the mud. The other sisters treated you as something between a saint and a mad woman, blessed for surviving but cursed by what survival had required. You worked in silence, your voice having returned but finding no words worth saying to women who could never understand that hell was not fire but ice, not demons but other suffering humans, not eternal, but feeling like it when each day brought new ways to die slowly. Sometimes young novices would approach, asking about St. Agnes, and you would look at them with their round faces and bright eyes, wanting to warn them that convents were where women went to be forgotten, but saying nothing because what good would warning do? The world offered no alternatives for girls without dowries, and at least here, the suffering was less deliberate, more neglect than cruelty. You had become a living ghost, present but not participating, going through motions of prayer and work, while your mind remained in that frozen kitchen with the corpses of women whose names were already being forgotten. At night, you dreamed of them all. Sister Claudine, Sister Therese, little Catherine, Margaret, who chose death over submission, and woke wondering why you had been cursed to survive when so many better women have been allowed to die. Years passed in this gentler prison, marked not by deaths, but by seasons you were allowed to witness. Feast days that included actual food, and the slow realization that you would live to be old in a way none of your sisters at Saint Agnes had achieved. Your hair, shorn regularly, grew back grey though you were barely 20, your body having aged decades in those 2 years of horror. The new abbey received novices regularly, girls who complained about the plain food and early prayers, and you wanted to shake them to make them understand their fortune, but remain silent because suffering was not a competition and their pain was real, even if it paled beside what you had known. You were assigned to teach the youngest girls their letters, your maimed hands making writing difficult, but your patience infinite because you remembered Sister Augustina's cruelty and swore to be different. The children feared you at first, this scarred woman who never smiled, but gradually warmed when they realized you would never beat them, never starve them, never lock them in isolation for bleeding. Sometimes, rarely, you found moments of something that wasn't quite peace, but was at least absence of active suffering, usually in the early morning when mist rose from the gardens and birds sang songs that didn't care about human misery. You had become what you never expected, a survivor who didn't want to survive, a teacher who had learned all the wrong lessons, a nun who no longer believed in God, but continued praying because the alternative was acknowledging that all that suffering had been for nothing. The news came on an ordinary Tuesday. Saint Agnes Abbey was being consecrated as holy ground, the bishop declaring that the women who died there were martyrs who had maintained their faith through unprecedented suffering. You laughed for the first time in 5 years, a sound so strange that sisters came running, thinking you were having a fit. Martyrs, they called them, as if choosing death would not have been apostasy, as if those women had options beyond suffering or suffering differently. The bishop wanted you to return for the ceremony, to speak about the holy sisters who had died so nobly. And the abbess strongly suggested you accept, seeing political advantage in having a survivor present. The journey back took 3 days, through countryside that had recovered from plague, villages rebuilt, fields green with harvest, life continuing as if hundreds of women hadn't died just miles away. The abbey looked smaller than memory, its stones cleaned for the ceremony, windows repaired, gardens trimmed, all evidence of horror erased, except for the cemetery, which had been expanded to accommodate the bodies found throughout the buildings. You stood where the kitchen had been, now converted to a shrine, trying to feel something for the place where you had watched everyone die, but found only emptiness. They had placed a plaque, listing the known dead, though half the names were wrong and dozens were missing entirely. History already rewriting itself to be more palatable. During the ceremony, you were supposed to speak about faith sustained through trials. But when the moment came, you simply stood silent, letting them interpret your muteness as overwhelming emotion, rather than the refusal it was to participate in sanitizing torture into hagiography. You returned to your new convent, understanding that history would remember St. Agnes as a place of holy suffering rather than systematic torture, martyrdom rather than murder through neglect, faith rather than the absence of alternatives for poor women. The younger sisters asked endless questions about the martyrs, wanting stories of spiritual ecstasy and divine visions, unable to accept that mostly there had been hunger, cold, and the slow dissolution of everything that made life bearable. You began writing at night, your maimed hands struggling with the quill, recording the true names and deaths of everyone you could remember. Sister Joan in the mud, Catherine crying for her mother, Margaret choosing starvation over submission, Therese bleeding through her palms in beautiful madness. The abbess discovered your writings and burned them, declaring such records inappropriate. that dwelling on past suffering prevented spiritual growth. Though you understood, she feared the political implications of contradicting the bishop's narrative. You started again, this time hiding pages throughout the convent, under stones, behind loose boards, in places that might survive when you did not.
Let future generations find these testimonies and know that Saint Agnes was not holy, but hideous, that God was absent from those halls, that the only miracle was that anyone survived at all.
Your body continued its slow decay, joints swelling with arthritis earned from years of cold stone, lungs rattling with damage from chronic starvation. But you persisted in your secret documentation, determined that somewhere, someday, someone would know the truth of what happened when the world decided certain women would. Old age came early. Your body at 30 wearing like a woman of 60, each winter harder to survive, as the damage from those 2 years compounded into a catalogue of chronic ailments. You had outlived everyone who might have remembered the truth of Saint Agnes, becoming the sole repository of memories that officially never happened. The young nuns cared for you with the same pity they showed all the elderly sisters, not knowing that you had earned every scar, every twisted joint, every laboured breath, through surviving what they could never imagine. Sometimes merchants passing through would mention the shrine at Saint Agnes, how pilgrims came to pray where holy women had died for their faith. And you would bite your tongue until it bled rather than scream that faith had nothing to do with it. You taught until your eyes failed, then sat in the garden listening to children read, their voices reminding you of all the girls who never got the chance to learn, who died illiterate and forgotten in that stone tomb. The abbess, a new one after the old one died peacefully in her sleep, asked you once about your time at Saint Agnes, having heard rumours that contradicted the official story. You looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, and simply said that the dead deserved better than lies, but lies were all the living could afford to give them. She never asked again, perhaps understanding that some truths were too heavy for the world to carry, that it was easier to believe in martyrs than murdered girls. The final winter arrived with familiar signs, breathing that wouldn't ease, fever that wouldn't break, the certainty that your body had finally exhausted its unnatural resilience. You lay in the infirmary where you had first healed, surrounded by sisters who prayed for your soul, while you thought only of the women who had no one to pray for them when they died. In your delirium, they all returned, Sister Claudine, harsh, but ultimately as trapped as everyone else, Sister Joan, young and terrified, Catherine small and crying, Margaret defiant to the end, Therese lost in beautiful madness, the abbess who died calling for her mother. They stood around your bed, not as ghosts but as witnesses, waiting for you to join their congregation of the forgotten. You wanted to apologize for surviving when they didn't, for having warm food and clean beds while they rotted in unmarked graves, for failing to make the world remember them as they truly were. But they seemed beyond caring. Their suffering ended while yours continued for decades after. The punishment of survival being to carry memories that no one wanted to hear. The priest came to perform last rites, speaking of heaven's glory and eternal peace. And you almost laughed at the thought that death was being sold as reward when you had seen it dispensed as punishment. Your last coherent thought was wondering if your hidden testimonies would survive, if someday someone would find them and know that Saint Agnes Abbey was not a holy place, but a graveyard where women were buried alive, slowly suffocated by poverty, neglect, and the world's indifference to female suffering. Death came not as the dramatic ending you had witnessed so many times, but as a gradual dimming, like a candle burning down to nothing, appropriate for a life that had been slowly extinguished over decades. The living sisters found you at Matin's bell, your body finally achieving the stillness it had been seeking since that winter in the frozen kitchen. They prepared you for burial with the same care given to any elderly sister, not knowing they were handling the last witness to a Holocaust that had been rewritten as hagiography. The ground that received you was soft with spring rain, different from the frozen earth that had refused so many bodies at St. Agnes, though death remained the same, regardless of season. They spoke words over your grave, about a life devoted to God, about faith rewarded with eternal peace, about joining your sisters in heaven, never knowing that your sisters were hundreds of forgotten women whose names were lost, whose sufferings were transformed into spiritual metaphor, whose deaths were meaningless except as warnings that no one would heed. Years would pass before a novice renovating the dormitory would find your hidden pages watermarked with tears and blood, telling of girls who died of hunger while growing food for others, who froze while washing clothes for warmth they would never feel, who were beaten for the crime of being human in a place that demanded angels. She would read about Margaret and Catherine and Therese and Joan, about an abbess who fled plague to save herself, about 60 becoming 12, becoming 1, about suffering that served no purpose except to demonstrate how cheaply women's lives were valued. Some would dismiss these writings as exaggeration, others would hide them again. A few might remember, but you were beyond caring, finally released from the burden of memory, free to join the anonymous dead who knew that sometimes the only mercy was forgetting, the only justice was oblivion, the only peace was the silence that came when your story, like theirs, finally ended. As Marguerite's story fades into the gentle darkness of history, you find yourself back in your own bed, warm and safe, breathing freely in air that carries no scent of suffering or stone. The weight of her testimony settles into memory's quiet corners, where all stories go to rest, becoming whispers that remind us how fortunate we are to live in times when hunger is choice, not circumstance, when cold is discomfort, not death sentence. Your pillow cradles your head with softness Marguerite never knew. Your blankets wrap you in warmth that hundreds of forgotten women would have considered miraculous. The night sounds around you, perhaps a car passing, a heater humming, a clock ticking, are symphonies of safety, rhythms of a world where convents no longer consume daughters, where poverty doesn't mean dying slowly behind walls that pretend to be holy. Let your breathing slow now, deep and easy, each breath a luxury that Marguerite earned through decades of labored gasps. Your body sinks into comfort, muscles releasing tensions they never knew they held, grateful for the simple miracle of enough. Enough food, enough warmth, enough freedom to choose your own suffering or refuse it entirely. Sleep approaches like a friend. Not the escape that Saint Agnes' sisters prayed for, but the restoration you deserve, carrying you toward dreams that can be sweet, because your reality is sweeter than anything those forgotten women dared imagine. Tomorrow, you will wake when you choose, eat what you desire, speak freely or remain silent by preference, not commandment. These are the gifts that Marguerite's suffering helped purchase, though she never knew it, that her testimony, hidden in walls, would eventually help build a world where such testimonies are no longer necessary. Rest now, blessed by the ordinary miracle of being alive in a time when that alone is not a burden but a gift.